One of the typical activities of business architecture is impact analysis and assessment. That's where we identify the impact of a change that the organization is going through. Could be as a result of executing a business strategy or perhaps going through a major business or digital transformation. And a technique that we use to perform impact analysis is called heat mapping, where we use a set of color codes to identify where we see the change and also identify the amount of impact that we see across the whole business ecosystem. And so here we applied a similar technique, a heat mapping technique, to identify the changes that we see in the recent version of the BIZBOK guide. That's version 12, which was published in early April 2023. And the color code that we use, green indicates there has been no changes in that specific part or section of the BIZBOK guide. Yellow indicates that there has been some minor changes. Orange indicates some moderate changes in that part or section of the guide. And finally, red indicates there has been some major changes in the content of the BIZBOK guide. So let's get into this. Starting with part 1, that's the introduction into the BIZBOK guide and the business architecture discipline. And the minor change here is that now there is kind of a one-liner elevator pitch for business architecture discipline, and that is to enable an effective and a streamlined execution of business strategies. And that's great to see. We are bringing more and more the focus and kind of narrowing down our focus on a true value of business architecture, which is an effective and a streamlined execution of business strategies. Looking at part 2, we see a variety of changes in this part of the version 12 of BIZBOK guide. And part 2, by the way, is a very important part of the guide. That's where we have all the core and extended domains of business architecture, and we are kind of setting the foundation for business architecture discipline. So section 2.1, that's the strategy mapping. There has been some minor changes and adjustments and clarifications in this section. Similar to section 2.2, also some minor adjustments and clarifications. But looking at section 2.3, that's organization mapping, and we see a few changes here. One is that a new benefit added into this section, and that's leveraging organization mapping to support scenarios such as merger and acquisition or reorganization. And of course, we might leverage organization mapping in many different scenarios, but in these typical scenarios, we would definitely leverage organization mapping, and it most likely would be at the center of our analysis and insights. And the other update in this section is the emphasis on business ecosystem. So when we talk about the scope of business architecture, we are looking at the whole business ecosystem, meaning that we go beyond the boundaries of the organization itself, and we look at, for instance, our external stakeholders, customers, suppliers, partners, third-party providers, and so on. And the other update is also looking at different types of business units. Of course, collaborative teams is one of the types, but also looking at terms such as division, department, or different business areas. So looking at section 2.4, that's value mapping, that focuses on value streams. We see a few changes here. One is a bit more clarification between the relationship of value proposition with the triggering stakeholders and also with the value items. So the triggering stakeholder is the ultimate beneficiary of the value proposition of a value stream, and is that entity that desires that value proposition. The relationship with value items is that those value items are the small chunks of value that it gets created at every stage of a value stream. And then all of these value items, they aggregate into the value proposition of that value stream. The other update is a new subsection in section 2.4, and that's about value consumption and creation. So putting again value proposition at the center and looking at two sides of that, how we create and consume the value proposition and who are the stakeholders on the two ends. When we create a value items and ultimately the value proposition, we have all the enabling capabilities and the participating stakeholders. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that triggering stakeholder is the one that consumes the value items and ultimately desires that value proposition. The other update in this section is more emphasis on the concept of binding object. It is not a new concept. You always had the concept of binding object, but putting a bit more emphasis in version 12 of BIZBOK guide. So binding object is that main object that's being worked on throughout the value stream, and it's the object that binds or connects other business objects that are also being worked on in the same value stream. And the state of binding object has an overall impact on the navigation of the whole value stream. So it's an important concept to keep in mind when we design or work through a value stream. Looking at section 2.5, that's information mapping. A couple of items to note here is the clarification between information concept and business objects, and also business artifacts. So business object, if you think of a physical customer as a business object, then the information concept is that abstract view of that physical customer that describes the profile, the type, the abstract relationships of that customer with other information concepts in the whole business ecosystem. So that's the distinction between business object and an information concept that describes the attributes of that business object, and also the distinction between information concepts and business artifacts, things such as an invoice or a document. And those are business artifacts. They are not really information concepts that's defined in the BIZBOK guide. There hasn't been any changes in section 2.6, but in section 2.7 or product, so the definition of the product has been updated at the beginning of this section, and also again has been a bit more emphasis on the business ecosystem view when we look at product mapping. So if our third-party providers or suppliers provide a product, that product is included in our product mapping exercise. So looking at section 2.8, that's stakeholder mapping. And again, the emphasis on business ecosystem when we do a stakeholder mapping, and specifically on the third-party partner, which is a category of an external stakeholder, and it could include stakeholders such as agents, suppliers, partners, and so on. And the other change also, it's in the stakeholder meta model, that value proposition is now added into the meta model. And just as a reminder, again, the relationship is that the stakeholder desires the value proposition. Under section 2.9 or policies, there has been just a very minor change in the meta model of policy, and that's the relationship between policy to policy, which is now read as policies associated with policy. Looking at part 3, that's where we have the practice conversation and also the alignment with other business related disciplines. There hasn't been any changes in sections 3.1, 3.2, and 3.3. In section 3.4, or business process management, so the title of the section has been shortened to the BPM, or business process management, but also in the benefits of this section, there is an emphasis on the benefit of leveraging the alignment between process architecture and business architecture for the purpose of a strategic transformation. Looking at section 3.5, that's case management and dynamic rules-based routing. We see a few changes here. So there is more emphasis and focus on the dynamic rules-based routing technique and the essential capabilities to enable dynamic rules-based routing has been refined. There are also two new subsections with the more detailed explanation on the work queue and also the transition indicators. Those are the two main elements that we leverage to design dynamic rules-based routing. The guidelines also has been updated and there are more detailed and refined guidelines for dynamic rules-based routing. There's also a new subsection that brings the focus on the industry standards that also leverage in case management and specifically reference to CMMN, that is the case management modeling and notation. It's an OMG or object management group standard. And in that new subsection, there's a bit of an explanation on the distinction between CMMN and the DRBR or dynamic rules-based routing technique. So there are no other changes through this part other than the last section, which is customer experience design. Again, a couple of minor changes in the meta model. That's where we see the mapping and relationship between business architecture and the customer experience design. One is the relationship between capability and outcome, which is now referred to as capabilities achieve outcomes, and also the relationship between value item and value proposition, which is value item aggregate into value proposition. Part 4 scenarios, there hasn't been any changes there. In part 5 or infrastructure, under section 5.1, that's the knowledge base and the meta model of business architecture. And now the BIZBOK version 12 has aligned the meta model view under this section to the latest meta model guide version 2.1 that was published back in November 2022. No changes in section 5.2. And then looking at part 6, that's the alignment of business architecture with IT architecture disciplines. No changes in section 6.1, that's the overview of the alignment between business architecture and IT architecture. But looking at section 6.2, or the alignment with enterprise architecture, a major change, of course, is the publication of TOGAF version 10 from the open group. And subsequently the alignment and the mapping of BIZBOK business architecture meta model to the TOGAF version 10 business architecture content model. So you find that alignment and the mapping in the version 12 along with the updates and the refinement of the guidelines of the alignment between business architecture and the TOGAF, the architecture development method or ADM, and specifically to phases A and B of the TOGAF ADM. And there is also reference to the 4 core guidelines that TOGAF version 10 has published on business architecture, and they are aligned to the 4 core domains of business architecture, which are capabilities, value streams, information, and organization. No changes in section 6.3 and 4, but looking at section 6.5 or service-oriented architecture alignment, so there is more emphasis on software services concept. It's not a new concept again, but bringing a more specific definition of software services, looking at the characteristics of software services in alignment with business capabilities, and also mapping guidelines has been updated. There is now more detail on the mapping guidelines between business architecture and service-oriented architecture, and also leveraging capabilities in scoping and designing software services, and finally leveraging information concepts to define the data requirements for software services in the SOA environment. Looking at section 6.6, that's the alignment between business information and data architecture. So one change here is the alignment with the version 2 of the BIZBOK. That's the data management body of knowledge, looking at all different components of data management in BIZBOK version 2, and then aligning it back to business information. And along with that, looking at data model derivation guidelines. So that also been updated in this section, along with the good example on how we can leverage capabilities and information maps, and specifically information concepts, to derive data entities, and also doing the data modeling work in the data management discipline. No changes for the rest of the sections in this part. And then in part 7, there is now a new case study added to the list of case studies under this part. That's in the financial industries. And finally, in part A, where we have all the reference models, there has been changes throughout almost all of these reference models. Changes in the capabilities, in the value streams, information mapping, and so on. And if you are a member of the Business Architecture Guild, I do encourage you to check out the Appendix D. That's the version history under the BIZBOK version 12. That's where you can find all the details of the changes in this latest version of the guide. And at the end, I just want to highlight that this heat mapping is for information only, and it's subjective purely based on our view of these changes in the latest version of the guide. So I hope you enjoyed this quick update and find it helpful in identifying where we see the changes and also the amount of change in different parts and sections of the BIZBOK guide.